Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos, buenos días. Vamos a empezar al comienzo a esta presentación del estudio Renovables 2022, análisis y forecasts para hasta el 2027. We are going to change to English, to switch to English, because we have here our guest, Heymi Bahar. I think you know him because he came here many times before that. Thank you, Heymi, for coming to present in Club Español de Energía once again this report. No, thank you, Heymi. I think the next time you will be coming here next year, or I think before the end of the year. I think so. You were doing many reports, maybe on renewables. You will do another one, and you will come here in this time. Okay, this is a very special report this year. This is a boom in renewables. I think we are going to hear from Heymi this situation we will have right now, and this is an analysis very documented about all these areas of policies, areas of relationship with H2, with many things I see on this question. I think the main things you can draw from this report will be related to all these policies that are starting right now after the crisis and linked to the crisis, the big boom in renewables. It's a pleasure of having here Heymi to explain that. This report was put out, I think, on the 6th of December last year. This is free of charge. You can download from the web of IEA or to review, and I recommended all of you to read this report because it's very interesting. I would like to say or remember the first sentence of the executive summary: energy security concern and new policies lead to largest ever upward revision of IEA's renewable power forecast. This is the main resume of this report of renewables. Nothing more. I think, as you know, after Heymi presentation, you will have a question and answer section, and you can send your questions to the chat. No, I think you can put in the chat. Here with me, this is Ana Padilla. She's going to pass that to Heymi and the next time. Well, I think this is not something that Heymi, I can introduce him. He's born in Istanbul and a Spanish citizen. He came here the first time, I think, 8 years ago. This is the responsible for the renewables report, and before he worked in another like OCDE and other parts, a very good friend of us. Heymi, the floor is yours. Okay.
Thank you very much for this great introduction. I'm sharing my screen at the same time. Let me know if you can see it. This year, as Arcadio mentioned, an interesting year for renewables, an interesting year for the energy world. As IEA mentioned multiple times, that this is truly a global energy crisis, which has very deep impact in the entire energy system. And there are obviously winners and losers of this invasion of Ukraine to Russia concerning the energy world. And geopolitics is aside, but for the energy, there will be deep impacts we see here at the IEA. Just to give you the headline number of our forecast, over the last 2 decades, renewables have grown about 2,500 gigawatts globally. And we expect basically this growth the similar amount of growth to happen in the next 5 years. So In that sense, renewables will achieve the growth of 20 years in the past in the next 5 years, which is an incredible achievement concerning the pace of growth. I would also like to give you which technology is leading this growth. Renewables basically are driven by the solar PV expansion. And for the first time in our forecast, the growth of about 1,500 gigawatts of solar PV changes the global installed capacity. Solar PV is expected to surpass first wind, then hydro, then natural gas, and finally coal in terms of installed capacity by 2027. Obviously, this question remains always when we present the capacity. What about generation? While solar PV will not become the largest source of generation in 2027, however, renewables as a whole will surpass coal to become the largest source of generation worldwide in 2025, just to give you the date, and early 2025. And by 2027, the gap, as you can see in the figure, will expand. What is driving this rapid growth? As Arcadio also mentioned, this is our largest forecast revision globally. And why we revise this forecast? Due to basically new policies and additional energy security challenges that many countries are currently tackling with. I'd like to mention European Union and United States here. EU has one of the largest forecast revisions we have. I'm going to go more into the detail in the coming slides. In the United States, Inflation Reduction Act has extended a lot of incentives. In India, the implementation challenges are slowly being tackled in order to meet ambitious targets. And the largest forecast revision is coming from China with the new 14th five-year plan, which is basically improving the business environment for renewables with the ambitious targets that we will see in the coming years. Just to give you a bit more detail about the global outlook, then I will focus a bit more on Europe, which most of you are really interested. China basically phased out renewable energy subsidies for solar PV, onshore wind, and offshore wind over the last 2 years, depending on the technology. It achieved an important growth over the last 5 years, and its growth will double in the next 5 years. In our main case, when we look at the European Union, the growth has been flat, as you can see, over the last 5-year chunks over the last decade. However, in our forecast, there's a huge acceleration of growth to basically more than doubling the growth in the next 5 years. And this is mainly due to the energy security becoming a major driver to achieve the renewables expansion in the European Union. There's been many policies that have been introduced, not only at the EU level, but also at the country level, which I will come back to that later. In the United States, we also see a similar pace of expansion. This is basically due to the IRA, who extended the solar PV tax incentives up until 2032, and this was not there before. This affects significantly our forecast, especially on the 2025 and beyond, which used to be based on the phasing out of these subsidies. India is also in a similar situation. Global COVID crisis has affected India the most in terms of our forecast, but now India's renewable capacity is coming back, and we expect that it will expand very rapidly. Brazil also is deploying, especially in the free market, I would say in the wholesale market, where there are long-term contracts are being signed. The Brazilian market is going beyond the government-led auction schemes, and this is also hosted in several other Latin American countries. In Africa, Maybe in terms of pace expansion in the next 5 years, it's the largest. This is a combination of hydropower, large hydropower plants coming online, but also at the same time, solar PV is becoming more and more attractive to increase the access, but also expand the renewable production there, especially considering the concessional financing that is flowing into Africa by World Bank, IFC, or African Development Bank. In Southeast Asia, we see an expansion of renewables. However, there are a lot of challenges there in terms of policy implementation and policy uncertainty. The growth is there, but compared to potential, it's quite limited when you consider the potential. So countries, on the one hand, as I mentioned, there's a pure energy security and climate change perspective in their policies. On the other hand, there is a diversification need that is coming to the picture for emerging economies as well, based on the recent global energy crisis. Looking at the EU, the growth in the EU will be mostly driven by solar PV. And this is due to the ongoing permitting challenges that many countries are trying to resolve, but we still don't see a major improvement already in that. There's a lot of work being done, but in that sense, we see the most deployment coming from PV, especially distributed PV playing an important role. We actually revised up our distributed PV, which is the fastest expansion in Europe. Compared to other technologies. This is due to basically Europe as already a huge distributed PV market, a lot of experience, but also it's the fastest way of expanding renewable capacity in Europe, considering the large permitting timelines. And in terms of countries, we actually revised up Spain's forecast, one of the highest, and with Germany. This is due to both pre-war deployment trends that we took into account after we published last year's report, but also on the other hand, the changing policy dynamics that is basically leading into a much higher forecast. In Germany, we see an important change in the permitting policies. Germany actually started changing permitting timelines and policies right after work, before European Union introduced new policies in May. In that sense, Germany increased the remuneration rate for renewables, changed the permitting timelines, and then basically made renewables at the center of the energy security in March and April in several government announcements. This led into higher targets in the country. When we look at the other European Union countries, the situation is not the same. For instance, in France, we did not revise up the forecast because the regulation and permitting and implementation challenges remain. We overestimated several technologies over last year, and we basically changed those into more realistic expectations this year. There are other changes as well. Poland is also driving renewables growth faster. Netherlands, Italy, all of them have made improvements concerning the regulation and policy, which we expect translated into a higher growth. So we compared our main case forecast with the REPowerEU targets in terms of the share of electricity of 2030. These are the targets that are not approved by the Council or Commission. These are being discussed, but we try to look at our forecast within this context. And our main case for renewable electricity is not fully on track, but our accelerated case, which sees 35% more growth in Europe based on three important challenges that is being made, and the most important being the permitting. The second one is the grid integration of renewables and faster grid capacity. And the third one is the keeping the financing rates in Europe, given that they are increasing, stable concerning the deployment of renewables, which creates a lot of competitiveness issues as the financing rates increase. In terms of the other sectors, transport and heat, I'll come back to that later as a global scale. the situation is not really good, which are the largest energy consumer areas in Europe. And they are falling behind in terms of the renewables share in transport. In our main case and in our accelerated case, maybe the transport sector may be on track in the coming years, but it requires a huge acceleration of renewable electricity in transport use, especially in electric vehicles, but also biofuels. The biggest discussion of last year was whether renewables are making windfall profits. We looked into this a bit more detail in our analysis this year. We went the deployment year by deployment and looked at the policies that are being implemented. So first, we need to look at whether policy structure enables renewables to get higher wholesale prices. When we look at this picture, the majority of renewables can have a wholesale market exposure, especially when you include hydropower, where most of the hydropower plants are not under any policy scheme. But when you look at mostly non-hydro renewables, the majority of the non-hydro renewables, mainly wind and solar, are not cannot be exposed to wholesale prices due to their previous policy schemes. However, the picture actually that we realized that although there is about 60% of renewables that can get the wholesale electricity prices, a minority is actually getting those prices because of the several utility structures and long-term contracts. And we realized that we looked at large European utilities one by one in Europe and tried to understand their situation with the hedging, long-term contracting, and so on and so forth. The idea that European utilities are making windfall profits are not true for all utilities, true for some utilities, which I will come back to that. And there's one utility group that I'm not going to name right now, but these are the largest utilities in Europe, in Italy, Spain, in France. They are in a situation where their revenues have increased significantly, but in terms of their profit, the situation is not reflected. There are 3 or 4 reasons for that. First, they are all exposed to retail markets where there are regulations not allowing them to increase the prices, the first point. The second point, their cost of generation has increased significantly. That's why they cannot get higher profits. And the third reason, usually, if they have hydropower capacity in their system, and in Spain, Italy, France, there was a huge drought last year, which means that they are actually getting lower revenues and lower profits compared to those amortized assets. So this picture actually leading into not a lot of profitability, but there's another group of utilities who have mostly hydro exposure, who were not hedged their contracts previously, especially the majority of their contracts, and they are actually making important profits. These are mostly hydro utilities in Northern Europe. They have very limited exposure on retail markets, plus they have retail market exposure where the prices are increased. So in that sense, those utilities groups are making important profit increases, especially those, as I said, related to hydropower generation in Northern Europe. However, when you compare this with oil and gas situation, obviously the profit margins are significantly higher compared to the higher prices. So in that sense, focusing on electric utilities, in our opinion, is not only the discussion that we should have. We should more have a discussion related to all energy sector. And we mentioned this in our report. Taxing profits, of course, are a way to do getting more revenues for the governments. The important thing here is to protect the vulnerable consumers, and there's a valid reason to do this. But the design of these policies that are taxing additional taxes should not harm the ability of the industry to invest in new renewables. This is an important point that we try to communicate in the report. because those companies who are vulnerable or can be vulnerable based on these taxes maybe are not able to invest more in renewables in Europe, which we need drastically to get rid of Russian gas. So there is an important vicious circle here that the policies need to consider, especially those that are basically taxing revenues, not profits in that sense. Looking at the global solar PV supply chain, this is an important topic that everybody is discussing. Every day we are seeing or hearing news about the new manufacturing facility that is coming online in China or new plants outside of China. We did actually a forecast, went through every single project. This is based on our previous analysis that we published in last July on global solar PV supply chains. I recommend all of you to read this detailed report where we look at every single segment of the solar PV supply chain and looked at the manufacturing capabilities and vulnerabilities of the solar PV supply chain. This is a continuation of this work we published. So we are expecting in two important markets an important expansion of solar PV supply chain investment, mostly in India and United States. United States is IRA, and India is the PLI scheme, which makes both of the, we analyze both of the schemes. They are making, they are mostly making the local production competitive with the lowest cost China production. And when you combine this with trade policies that these two countries have, we see an important expansion of the manufacturing capacity. You can ask why Europe is not expanding here. There are a lot of plans. Yes, there are a lot of announcements and initiatives, but there are no actual incentives that are being put on the table. When you look at the difference between the United States IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and India PLI, we are talking about a big difference between European policies, which remains only in the words, but not in terms of the money. On the other hand, China is coming even stronger in the investment. China will invest 3 times more than any other country, a combination of the countries outside of China, which means in terms of the capacity, first, we will see an overcapacity in the market, which will lead back into the price declines. Whether China's role in terms of capacity changes, yes. In terms of wafers, yes, but for the others, not that much. China will remain, in terms of installed manufacturing capacity, the largest country in the world. Its share will decline, but considering the overcapacity that is coming into the market, plus the trade measures, current trade measures that countries are implementing, actually China's share in production will be expected to decline significantly if those trade measures remain, which means that if the trade measures not buying Chinese products basically continues in several parts of the world, restrictions, then the people, the developers will buy locally, giving the incentives, and then the production share of China can decline if these basically policies continue to remain in place. This year, we also look at hydrogen production, but on the renewable side. So we try to estimate how much renewable capacity will be built dedicated for hydrogen production. We went through the project by project announcements and then assessed what can come online in the next 5 years. We saw that 100-fold increase by 2027, about 50 gigawatts that is coming online. Obviously, when you consider our forecast of 2,400 gigawatts, this remains a small portion, but an important step in the next 5 years to be achieved, led by China, because China has announced a 14 5-year plan important renewable hydrogen policy. But this is not the driver of our forecast. The provinces, especially Inner Mongolia, has announced an incredible hydrogen target, which are basically driving our forecast going forward. And there are important mega bases in China already being deployed, renewable mega bases, and this will be entered into that. And when you look at Europe, obviously there are a lot of plans in Europe and United States. Those are real policies that are being deployed. We see an important expansion there as well, especially onshore wind and solar PV. For offshore wind, unfortunately, there are a lot of projects in the pipeline that are being deployed. So new projects will not be commissioning in the next 5 years. It will be beyond 2027 for hydrogen. However, there is an important picture change. Some countries, Australia, many Middle East and North African countries, and Chile, are deploying hydrogen not for local consumption, but to export, given their incredible solar and wind resources. That's why we see the share of hydrogen in their overall capacity expansion between 15 and 20%, which is significant. These are mostly export-related projects. And important beauty about the hydrogen, green hydrogen, especially or renewable-based hydrogen, is that we see the projects all over the world. It's mostly diversified geographically. There's a lot of financing and project financing that is being done in multiple parts of the world. Many countries, including developing countries, emerging economies, and advanced economies, are all have hydrogen policies. Whether how much of this will become operational is a big question mark, obviously, but it's an important step in terms of geographical diversification. One important point on biofuels, which we did for the first time, a feedstock analysis, whether how much of our global production per year is today coming from crops and waste and residues, and how much it will come from in 2027 in those different types of fuels. We did crop by crop the analysis. I see this as an important change in the biofuels market, especially in advanced economies, given the carbon emission reduction targets in the transport sector, which are not based on blending mandates, but mostly on the carbon reduction mandates, where waste and residues perform much better. In advanced economies, we basically expect majority of the new biofuels production to come from waste and residues. This is better for the climate, this is better for the economy, and this is the unused waste and residue products that are being used. Overall, globally, 1/3 of the growth will come from waste and residue production, which is extremely important factor. In emerging economies, though, crops will remain the largest source of growth, with a small expansion of waste and residues, which will change beyond 2027. However, the demand for waste and residues create pressure for the supply chain of these feedstocks. As the United States and Europe is driving these policies and want to expand this production based on the policy setting, we expect that animal fats and used cooked oil share in biofuels will reach very soon about 100%, which means that there needs to be new bio-based diesels, and biojets are mostly at risk. So we really need to basically find new ways of finding feedstock or collecting feedstock for these kind of fuels where the demand is increasing drastically. And for sugarcane and basically corn, the share of biofuel production remains flat, doesn't increase, doesn't decline. But for vegetables, oils, and used cooking oils and animal fats, there's an important increase. So policies need to address, first of all, the collection of these waste and residue sources, because there will be higher prices already, which is seen in the market, but also innovation from the companies to use better use of these sources. Last point I like to make is related to the accelerated expansion. This is only for electricity. So we expect 25% more growth in our accelerated case, mostly driven by solar PV, but also wind. And the biggest barrier for wind, higher wind expansion, is all around the world remains permitting. This is basically hampering the faster growth of renewables, not only in advanced economies, but also emerging economies right now. And when we compare this expansion with net zero, this is the biggest question. Solar PV is becoming closer and closer to the deployment levels that we will need in the net zero by 2050 globally scenario. And this is an important step forwards. Solar PV expansion is basically has less permitting challenges, economically more attractive, and there's a new manufacturing capacity coming out, leading to a more diversified supply chain in the coming 5 to 10 years. So in that sense, we will see an important step forward for solar PV and getting closer to the targets. On the other hand, wind is the biggest gap in terms of achieving the net zero target, as I mentioned, related to financing challenges. And with that, I would like to present one last slide on heating, which is again a forgotten giant. Every year I present this heat slide in the thing. This year there is a bit of a change. Electrification is really visible in our market report this year. Especially you can see that in industry we expect an important electrification, and renewable electricity use is incredibly important for the world in the heat consumption, and for buildings as well, driven by the heat pumps and solar thermal growth. And when we look at the electrification, the biggest change is actually changing the power system, which is contributing to the electrification. You can see in the figure that the contribution of change in the share of electricity in heat supply, which means electrification, contributes the largest, followed by the share in renewables. This is compensated by the change in heat demand in buildings because of the efficiency. But the important factor here is really the electrification is driving the growth and the share of renewables in the system. And with that, I will basically leave the floor to the Q&A. I can see some of the questions, but I don't know, Anna, how do you want to moderate this? You can ask, I can check. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Heymi. Very interesting and very clear. Yes, as you can see, there is a few questions in the Q&A section. If you want, I can read it for you, or you can read it at the same time. I will start maybe with the USA related. No, there are two. One is very specific. It's a question on offshore wind. Can recent comment from large developers as Iberdrola, Ørsted, about review of agreed terms with the USA regulators, giving increasing OPEX and CAPEX, impact your midterm outlook for offshore wind capacity, installed capacity? That is very specific, is the first. And the second is regarding a chart that you show. It says if IEA has revised by only 2-3% the renewables energy capacity required in the USA to power green hydrogen project. Is that too low in light of the hydrogen incentivized contained in the Inflation Reduction Act? That is the two questions for US.
Okay, so I'll start with the second one. Second one, that 2 to 3% is not a revision, is the share of renewable capacity deployed to the dedicated to hydrogen over the share of overall renewable capacity deployed in the United States. So it accounts for 2% because there are many projects not being developed for the green hydrogen production. This is not a revision. The first question, I would like to read myself as well, but I cannot read because I didn't capture fully the question. Could you maybe repeat again, Anna?
Repeat? Yes. Yeah. Can recent comment from large developers as Ørsted or Iberdrola about review of the agreed terms with the USA regulators, giving increase in OPEX and CAPEX impact? If this can impact in your term outlook for offshore.
Okay, so So the question that to be honest with you, we have not realized, we have not analyzed this recent development from the developers that are, and we did not analyze in the forecast. But I can tell you one important thing for our offshore wind, United States offshore wind forecast. We are a little bit conservative about offshore wind in the United States compared to other organizations who are expecting much higher growth for two reasons. The first one is that US market still remains very, very small in terms of the learning curve. It requires much more expansion. The second one, the agreement between the permitting agreements between state and the federal water parts are very, very challenging in terms of achieving the expansion that is needed. And I will add another one. The supply chain is an important challenge in the United States concerning especially the ships and installation ships. So in that sense, we are a bit conservative, but I can come back to you once we look at these announcements and how US regulators will, given the increase in OPEX and CAPEX, how they can look at the situation. Thanks.
Thank you, Heymi. There is another question about biomethane. Say that would like to know where is placed within the study and if you are considering it in the future in a specific chapter.
Yeah, so in our forecast, biogas and biomethane use, so first of all, in biogas use for electricity is included in our bioenergy expansion, bioenergy capacity expansion in our electricity forecast. It is also included in our heat forecast. It is also included in our transport forecast, but they are, in terms of the specificities, they're a bit small, so that's why we are not showing it specifically. However, IEA did a biomethane analysis, World Energy Outlook colleagues, I think 2 years ago. I'm not sure whether this will be renewed or not, but I will ask my colleagues and come back to you.
Thank you. About PV manufacturing, you mentioned that incentive of the US and India will position then on the top of PV manufacturing. And you in Europe, you say that there is not the same level of incentive or something like that. So does it mean that the next generation funds is not enough? Your reflection on that.
So this is a very good question. Next generation funds can be enough in terms of the volume, but the allocation of those are an important challenge. So if you look at EU funds allocated for renewables over the last 20 years, 2 decades, the question remains very interesting because there is money, especially on the paper, to be helped for manufacturers, but getting this money and using this money is an important challenge in Europe, has always been. And there are billions of grants and loans that are announced within the European Union for the COVID-19 recovery, if you remember. There are no news about how they are allocated. And because it's super challenging bureaucratically to allocate those funds. That's first point. First of all, allocation of those is an important challenge. The second one is the incentives according to the historical experience. Maybe in Europe it will be different. But when you look at China and how China achieved this incredible manufacturing capabilities on solar PV, it has been a support of the industry over the last 15 years with multiple incentives, including support for investment grants, cheap loans, land allocation, energy, incentivizing energy, and so on and so forth, and creating a market for the innovative products, local demand. So when we look at over the last 2 decades, what Europe has achieved in terms of the deployment of solar PV manufacturing is close to zero. Actually, it lost a lot of because all these incentives were not there. In the US, capabilities were really limited. Why we are saying that US and India is very concrete? Because in the United States, first of all, tax credits are supporting output, and it gives a lot of incentives on the output side. On the India, they basically bridge the investment capex difference and with an upfront grant money to be able to match, make India competitive. Plus, there are trade measures that are restricting Chinese products to come to India and United States. Combination of those makes a big difference. In Europe, there is money, yes, but it's not a tax credit. It's not based on output. There's grant and loans that are being allocated for special projects. However, I have not seen a major project going really forward in Europe out of these incentives. Maybe this will change with the Ursula von der Leyen announcement last week. She said that she's considering to change the state aid guidelines, which is an important barrier, which has been an important barrier to achieve investment in Europe in multiple sectors. So if those happen, obviously, I think there may be more investments coming up.
Thank you, Heymi. Related also to PV, solar PV, taking into account all these plans put on the table by the US and India, China, how do you see the trend in global PV supply in relation to the demand?
So, as I mentioned, right now, if all the plants that are announced, manufacturing plants, that are announced that come online by 2027, the world will have approximately 1,000 gigawatts of manufacturing capability in all PV segments. 1,000 gigawatts is more than what is needed in our net zero scenario, which is 630 gigawatts by 2030. So maybe the demand will exponentially grow at that levels. And in 2027, we will see 800, 900 gigawatts of manufacturing demand in the world, which I'm not sure, to be very honest with you, that reaching from 250 gigawatts this year to about 800 gigawatts in the next 3 years or 4 years is a little bit, I don't think it's very likely, considering that many emerging economies have a lot of policy uncertainties. So in that sense, oversupply is inevitable. Is it an end of the world? No, because solar PV market has seen a lot of oversupply situation, especially coming from China. And then the market adjusted with lower prices and closing down the old factories. This will happen again, probably. But the biggest question mark for me, and with recent announcements as well, is the trade policy that is associated with the solar PV trade products and restrictions. So this is a bit uncertain. I would like to highlight 2 days ago, Chinese government announced that it will restrict wafer exports into other markets. It's considering to restrict. So if this happens, imagine that 97% of the wafers are produced in China. So what happens in all the cell production that is outside of China, basically receiving wafers to produce panels? It's a big question mark for me. And it's a big challenge, I think, coming up for the world.
Thank you. Putting the focus in Europe, do you think that Europe could replace all the gas and other fossil fuels coming from Russia with renewables by 2027?
So, yes and no. Renewables will contribute significantly. We did an analysis for 2023. How much basically renewables can contribute with a lot of other supply diversification measures and energy efficiency measures. We analyzed that if Europe doubles solar PV and wind expansion in 2023 compared to 2022, which is an important gap, so which means 7 gigawatts of solar PV deployed in 1 year in Europe and 27, 28 gigawatts of wind deployed in 1 year in Europe. which are imported numbers. If those happen, even in the next winter, coming up winter in 2023, Europe will have a very good chance of avoiding any crisis, given that Russia will close the tap. But when we look at 2027, I'm very optimistic about this because Russian gas accounts for 1/3 of Europe electricity, used to about 1/3 or 40% of the European electricity production. First of all, the LNG market will expand in the coming years. There's a lot of plans to replace that. The second question is that Europe has an important chunk of renewables that will come online. But the biggest challenge will be to integrate those renewables and flexibility measures. So gas provides an important flexibility in European markets. If those gas plants some of them will get new LNG, some of them will get gas from somewhere else. But if we reduce the gas consumption power generation overall, if we have to, we need other sources of flexibility. And we need to change how we use the hydropower in Europe. We need to change how we use the pumped hydropower in Europe and other sources of storage. And this has been a big issue which we raised in our hydropower special market report 2 years ago, which that the current market design doesn't remunerate at all this kind of a long-term seasonal storage, which Europe already needs today in this picture. So there needs to be other policies combined to be able to achieve those kind of measures.
And there is another question about hydrogen. Is there a view or analysis of the efficiency of the potential trading flows of green hydrogen, considering the different supply-demand balances by region, country?
So we do not cover this in this report, but our hydrogen review, I think, covers this kind of analysis. I'm not sure. I can come back to you and pay that, but I will tend to agree concerning the demand supply projects, and if they will be traded, whether there's a demand agreement outside of that country who's producing it is a big question mark. We see a lot of electrolyzer capacity announced on the supply side to be deployed, which is about, I think now, about 400 gigawatts or so, which is huge. But demand is very limited right now, and how these trade flows will be realized is a big question mark. Obviously, there are a lot of losses in the production from renewables, than electrolyzers, than trade, than gasification, and all these processes. But for some industrial applications, this is possibly the only way to decarbonize these sectors. So in that sense, I think it will find demand, especially in Europe.
Yes. Moving to Spain, what do you think will be the conditions to get the accelerated case you presented in the study for Spain?
So for Spain, the accelerated case and the first and the most important condition is to certainty in terms of regulation of how the market will look like in the coming years, and how the recent regulations that are introduced to basically market caps and the taxation and all this stuff, what will happen to those? It's an important thing. Obviously, Spain introduced one of the most drastic measures to tax renewables, and there is the gas market cap. These are all policies to protect consumers, which are justified in many ways because there's a lot of energy poverty going on in Spain and many parts of the world. In that sense, obviously that's justified, but we will see how the design of these policies, which are introduced for short term in the first place, will be able to adopt it in the future, and how the market will rebalance with the change in policies, and how much money utilities will have to invest in renewables in Spain. We saw after our forecast a lot of announcements that companies are thinking of investing outside of Spain, not in Spain. Obviously, this is not fully in our forecast, even in the main case forecast. And we will reanalyze this, the impact of this, the length of the regulations that are being announced and how this will happen. But one of the most important things is how the uncertainty in the Spanish market in terms of the future regulations will be resolved. Because before the war, Spanish market has been growing an incredible pace with the corporate PPAs, unsubsidized projects, and flourishing distributed PV market, to be honest with you, with the recent regulation changes that has done 1.5 years or 2 years ago by now. So in that sense, it was an important step forward, and the Spanish market was one of the, after Germany, one of the largest markets. Still it is, but it is important to understand how the market will evolve. Since then, there have been a lot of changes that is being done, and a lot of uncertainties being introduced. And in order to accelerate the case to achieve, we need to get over those uncertainties.
Thank you, Heymi. Yeah, an important issue for debate this year is going to be the possible future electricity market design, about the different proposals that the countries have been making, including the Spanish. What are your reflections about this? If you want to add something, thank you.
Yeah, so on this one, I don't have a lot of things to say because we are working on this at the IEA right now to analyze the possible market design options, and we will come up with some outputs next year. This is a very sensitive and very complex topic, and this topic I think requires a lot of detailed attention in terms of the long-term and short-term markets and how they are designed. And one of the most important things that Europe needs to think about, though, the new market design needs to do 3 things at the same time, which is required basically. The first one, attracting renewable investment. That's the first condition because of the climate change goals. Attracting flexibility investment, which is required for energy security and to expand wind and solar, whether the market basically gives the signals for new flexibility investment. And the third one, whether the market provides a long-term contracting mechanism, which is liquid for renewables, because they need this kind of a contracting mechanism at least 7 to 10 years or 5 to 10 years, depending on the market, in order to achieve financing, because these are not like coal or gas plants. So these 3 important points, a new market design needs to tackle at the same time, because if you tackle one and not the other one, you are not successful, because it doesn't work. So in that sense, we are trying to analyze these 3 points and how a possible market design can basically change the structure. But what is more important, in my opinion, is the cooperation between the European Union countries to agree on something, because there are very different opinions within the European Union countries about market design. On the one hand, there are few countries and few stakeholders argue that the market should remain as it is efficient, it has been working, no problem if the price goes to 5,000 euros per megawatt hour. This is the market. Market gives the signal, market will resolve the problems. That's one opinion of the market design. The second opinion is the full intervention to the market, removing the merit order pricing, going back to the central planning, and so on and so forth. There are 2 different opinions that are being discussed within the European Union right now. I'm not saying that the European Union will go towards the more extreme central planning structure. I don't think this is even possible. But where it will allocate itself, in which part, probably on the market, free market side, that's European structure as a whole. But where it will be located between that, it's a big question mark for me. And this requires a lot of cooperation. This requires a lot of thinking, and this requires a lot of future thinking, how the market will look like. But Europe, one advantage that I see, that Europe has to be at the forefront of this because it's the largest renewable share in the world. It has, excluding, of course, some large hydro countries, Costa Rica, Brazil. I'm not talking about those, but I'm talking about real wind and solar, high wind and solar penetration. Europe is the most experienced, and whatever Europe will create will be replicated around the world, possibly. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Heymi. It's almost 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for all the questions. I don't know if we have.
Okay,
Arcadio?
thank
Yes,
you very
pass.
much, Heymi. It's a pleasure having you here. Thank you for this outstanding presentation, for the answers. You know, they are not easy. Some of them, no, it's not easy to answer all of this. Above all, this last one, no? About all. Okay, thank you. I hope next time you will be here. Thank you very much, and I recommend all of you. This is a boom for renewables in the near future. If I follow your presentation and your report, no, I recommend all the people who are watching this to download and to see the recommendations you are giving and the data you are showing over there. Thank you very much and enjoy. Okay. Buenos días para todos. Buenos días para ti, Heymi. Buenos días.